Welcome back, listeners. This is BornCurious, coming to you from Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm your co-host, Ivelisse Estrada.
And I'm your co-host, Heather Min. For those who don't know us, Harvard Radcliffe Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. This podcast is, like its home, about unbounded curiosity. And with each episode, we share a little bit of the work happening here.
And today we have a juicy episode for y'all. Let me ask you this, Heather. Do you keep a diary?
I did. In grade school, I had a little leather-bound book where I wrote all about my deeply private and very earnest pre-adolescent angst. What about you?
I'm a terrible chronicler of my life, but when I was in high school, I did. I'd be mortified to read it now, though. I cringe just thinking about it.
And yet, today on BornCurious, we're going to talk to someone who is trying to read as many personal diaries as possible.
That's right, Heather. Today, we're talking to Kathryn Allamong Jacob. She is a historian associated with Harvard's History Department, who last year retired from her post as the Johanna Maria Frankel Curator of Manuscripts at the Schlesinger Library, right here at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. She's written 3 books, most recently King of the Lobby, The Life and Times of Sam Ward, Man About Washington in the Gilded Age. And now she's undertaken a project in which she hopes to read and describe every diary in the collections of the Schlesinger Library. Hi, Kathy.
Good morning.
Hi, Kathy. We're so excited to have this chance to talk with you and learn about your project.
I'm excited to talk to you about it. It's been going well.
First, Kathy, I want to talk about you because you describe yourself as a historian, not a librarian. You have a PhD in history. Yet, in addition to your curatorship at the Schlesinger, you have worked as an archivist at Johns Hopkins and at the National Archives. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen, and what's that been like?
Well, I got my PhD in history. I thought that I'd rather do public history than teach at a university, so I explored a bunch of things. I was lucky enough to get the archivist job at Johns Hopkins. I was the first archivist at the university. Before I went to the National Archives, I was associate historian of the Senate in Washington. And from then, my husband claimed I left when the receptions were over and there was no more interesting food. But then I left for the National Archives. We moved here to Boston, and I was deputy director of the American Jewish Historical Society, which involved both my background in archives and American history. And then I was lucky enough to get the position here, which had been held for more than 20 years by Eva Mosley, someone I had always admired, and I had always admired the library. So this was pretty much my dream job. And that lasted the whole way through 21 years.
What did that job entail, the curator of manuscripts?
I was in charge of growing the collections, and that meant working with donors we had identified as people whose collections would be helpful for the library to have. The library's mission is to document the lives of women in America, and that's all kinds of women in America. So some of it was proactive. Sometimes people would contact the library with material. It meant looking at dealers' catalogs, looking at eBay to some extent, reading women's history journals, going to conferences, finding out where scholarship might be going, and trying to support that with manuscripts.
You're a trained historian, and how does the experience of engaging with these particular artifacts and historical materials, may I say, differ from how you've engaged with archival materials of the past, and therefore how you are now thinking about it?
In the course of preparing the database and thinking about the diaries I wanted to pursue, I've learned that diaries and diary writing is a really hot topic internationally. In Italy and France and England, there are national diary projects to gather like all the diaries in the country over centuries together, or at least identify them and say where they are. There are international conferences on diary writing. It's really hot. And I was interested to find that out. I've used diaries as a historian in all of my books. And now as I read them, I'm looking at them more as what can they augment? What can they supplement? What stories could be better told if you looked at these documents? How more authentically women's lives could be portrayed if you read more about real women's experiences?
That's what I was immediately thinking about. What an incredible resource to say somebody who writes historical fiction.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
So tell us about your project. What is Dear Diary?
When I was contemplating retirement, I wanted a project that would be fun, that would keep me interested for a long time, that would benefit researchers, benefit the library, and keep me involved in the library's collections, because I was responsible for bringing in a lot of them, and I wanted to make sure people used the ones that were there. I'd like to think, Ivelisse, that I will read all of the diaries, but there are more than 3,000 volumes of diaries. So far I've done 136.
Yeah.
So all of them is probably a stretch, but I've always liked diaries as a genre. I think they have the potential to influence scholarship more than they do. And one of the reasons is because there just isn't time to describe them in great detail. Special collection staffs do a great job cataloging the material that comes in. But when 1,000 feet of new material is coming in every year, there just isn't time to read material in depth. It's not possible for them, but when I retired, it was possible for me. So I developed the diary project. I worked on a database. It has, I think, 36 fields, and I'm reading every word. So, I mean, how cool is that? I'm spending retirement reading other women's diaries.
So how do you decide which ones to start with?
Yeah.
Well, we have the diaries of a lot of very prominent women, Judy Chicago, Susan B. Anthony, a few diaries of Angela Davis. But I didn't think researchers needed my help to find those. So I've been focusing on the diaries of, I hesitate to call them ordinary women, but they're women who are known among their family, friends, their community, but maybe not beyond that. But their lives are representative of many women's lives in America, and documenting them and understanding them was my start.
What is the time period in American history that you're covering?
The library's earliest diaries start in the late 1700s, late 18th century. There aren't very many. They become more and more frequent through the 19th century. The earliest one I've done is 1780, I think, and the most recent is in the 1980s. But we have diaries from living women. Every January, I would get a flurry of little envelopes of women who sent me their diaries for the previous year. So the collection goes up to 2020, probably.
And we should note that when you say volumes, like when you say that there are more than 3,000 diaries, that's not more than 3,000 women.
No. Some collections only have one diary. Others contain, we have collections that have more than 50 diaries of the same woman covering decades. So when I talk about a diary, we have the diary of over 650 women, but that translates into more than 3,000 volumes.
Wow.
And are they all women?
The great majority are women, but we do have some men's diaries. We have multi-generation family collections that might have the diaries of 10 different individuals in that family and cover centuries, and there might be a few men in there.
And what form do they take? Because when I was younger and kept a diary, it came with that little lock. So I'm wondering, are they all like little books?
Most of them are little books, but not all. I didn't keep a diary for very long, but mine was aqua plastic. It had a cat with rhinestone eyes, and it had a lock. And once I lost the key, I threw the diary away. We have a lot of those diaries, pink plastic, aqua plastic. Most women do use a book of some sort. Some are official diaries. One of our women was married to, this is in the early 19-teens. One of the women's husband was a wallpaper salesman. So she kept her diary on the back of pages in a wallpaper sample book. So it's about 5 inches thick. Several women use account books that their fathers or their brothers gave them. They might turn them over and use them, the empty pages in the back. One of the most interesting is a diary that a homeless woman kept in a shelter in New York in the 1980s. She wrote on the only thing she had, which was rolls of toilet paper. And somehow she managed to keep them intact and with her for the next 20-some years.
That's incredible.
Most of them are handwritten. Some are very difficult to read, but you get used to them by the 5th or 6th volume. A few are typed. Some are typed after the fact, so a woman might actually allude to the fact that she wrote it by hand and then typed it up. You have to wonder why. I haven't done any digital diaries, although we have some.
I'm thinking about how students today in the American public schools, they're not learning cursive.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, so
right.
I'm wondering if the role of the archivist will also entail transcribing these handwritten diaries.
That's a very good point. Special collections libraries are developing tutorials on how to read cursive for researchers.
Wow.
At the Schlesinger, we've had situations where young researchers have brought a book to the reference librarian saying, "Can you help me? I can't read this." And we thought maybe the handwriting was very faint, or no, we could read it.
But they're written in code now.
Right. We do have diaries that have codes, some which we've cracked and others which we haven't. Some, I think, have little stars for when couples had intercourse. Some have little circles, and I think those might be when women are menstruating. Some have completely opaque symbols. We don't know what they mean. But it's clearly a code. So women do write in code. But there are lots of people thinking of how to employ computer science to make this easier. And the libraries participated in some of those projects. That would be really cool.
Now, what I want to talk about is what you found in these diaries, the stories, the recurring themes.
It's lots of fun, and I've found some of them are just plain exhausting, especially the farm women. They write of getting up at 5 in the morning and baking 5 pies, 3 cakes, a pot roast, baking a ham. This is all before lunch, before the hands come in from the field, usually in October or September when it's harvest time. They write of being exhausted at night, and I'm exhausted just from reading them. Some of them are very funny. Some of them are intentionally funny. There's a young woman, alphabetically the very first Radcliffe graduate, Annie Leland Barber. She graduated in 1883, and she writes of condescending professors who speak and belittle the women students. If they think the women didn't catch on to this, they're mistaken. Some of them are surprising. One of the most surprising is June Callender. In the 1950s, she's telling us about 4-H and her clothing that she's sewing. And then there's this entry about a friend in high school who met a young man. After only a few weeks, they got engaged. He was arrested for stealing cars, which was bad enough. But after he was arrested, it was discovered that he was a woman. And I'm like, what? I missed something here. And I went back, and she said her friend must feel like a fool. This is in Versailles, Indiana, in the 1950s.
Wow.
So it was surprising.
To say the least.
Some of them are heartbreaking. They're women contemplating abortions, women who have miscarriages, women who have very unhappy marriages. Those are quite sad. They're women that I've gotten attached to, and so as their lives unfold, you follow along. Some of them are really quite horrifying. The woman who wrote on toilet paper earlier in her life when she was married, she and her husband had a horrible marriage, knockdown, drag-out fights that she would write about in detail. He would throw toasters. She would throw radio alarm clocks. She abused her children, and she would write about it in great detail. And at one point, she writes about a fight with her 15-year-old daughter in the kitchen. She pins her to the floor. She's slapping her. Her daughter escapes to her room. And 3 days later, this daughter commits suicide by self-immolation in the family garage. And before she dies, she tells the firefighters that she wanted to die because her mother hated her and she couldn't stand living in their home. And it was so shocking and so horrifying. And the mother, for decades, manages to convince herself this was an accident. She was not responsible. Occasionally she has episodes where she addresses it and thinks she might have had something to do with it. It was very difficult to read. And this woman in general is a very difficult woman whose diaries document a very troubled life. That's a hard one. I can only read it for a few hours at a time.
She documented many decades of her life.
It starts in the 50s. There are at least 50 diaries.
You're such an intimate witness.
You are. I mean, for most women, this is private writing. Most women write in their diaries with no thought that someone else will ever read them. And many of them, they see their diaries as their only outlet. Some of them are very, very moving, very sad.
So I wonder about your experience of having access to this kind of interior private information.
It is something I think about. Yeah, it's something that I think about. I'm only reading diaries that are open to researchers. We have many diaries whose donor closed them for a certain period of time. Like they might be closed until the woman's death. Sometimes they might be closed until 20 years after her death. Some require written permission from the donor to be used. So I'm not even looking at those. So I have read one diary. The woman donated it. It's open. In the deed of gift, that's very clear. But you turn the page and it says, "Woe to you who's reading my diary." Uh-oh.
So you're cursed now.
I know.
Kathy.
She didn't say anything specific. But,
So they're talking to you as well.
well, I'm very much a voyeur, reading of their most intimate moments. June Callender, the woman who talked about the friend who was engaged to a young man who turned out to be a young woman, she writes for pages and pages about her first experience of sex with a man in college. And there's even a postcard in the collection of the little motel in Indiana that they went to. It's, she had a very good experience. But it's very intimate.
Wow. And so we've talked about, some surprising things, and we've talked about your least favorite person to read. Mm-hmm. What about your favorites?
One of my favorites is a very brief diary of a young girl named Ruth Teichman. I have to say that's a pseudonym. We can't reveal her name according to the donor's agreement until 2042, when she would have turned 100 and presumably will be dead. She's 13. It's 1957. She's very smart. She's from a wealthy family in the New York City suburbs. She's articulate. She works hard in school. She does well. She wants to do well. She and all of her friends are very concerned about their periods. The boys in the class, poor Michael, she writes that she really likes Michael, but he smells when they dance close. She's just so self-aware and so articulate and introspective. She has a good relationship with her parents. It's clearly the 1950s, from the movies she sees, the books she reads, the Diary of Anne Frank, the movies she goes to. And at one point, she talks to her mother and she writes this all down and says, yeah, the boys just don't seem to like me as much as they like other girls. I'd really like to be more popular. I don't know what to do. Her mother says, why don't you talk to your dad, Ruthie? So Ruthie talks to her dad, who's a pretty sympathetic guy in this diary. And he says, Ruthie, you're just too smart. Boys don't like smart girls. You have to dumb it down. Oh, and Ruthie writes, good idea, Dad. I think I'll try that. And you're just like, no, Ruthie, no. She's very endearing. I like her very much. And I also like a woman named Evelyn Wallace. We have 40 years, I think, of her diary.
Oh, my.
She's also very articulate. And she's like, it's like she walked out of the pages of the Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan was clearly writing about her and her generation of educated women. She goes to college. She marries a lovely man who's a graduate student in American history at Columbia. So he's studying, and they go to dinner at the home of historians that I've read. So it was an interesting connection. But they have 4 children in pretty quick succession, and she's a stay-at-home mom, and she gets very involved in their school. But as the years pass, she's very dissatisfied, and she feels like she's in quicksand. She feels like she's smothering, and she wants a wider life. Her husband's very supportive. She becomes a teacher at a private school, and she loves it. And from accounts, it seems like she's a wonderful teacher. Her diary entries are long and thoughtful. They tell us about her aspirations for her own life, her children. And then in her 60s, she's diagnosed with breast cancer, and then she has seizures. And she keeps writing. She finally is in a nursing home. David visits every day. And the entries get shorter and shorter. The handwriting is harder to read. And then there's the last entry that says, can't continue, need lines. And it's just really, really sad. It's the last entry. She dies, I think, 3 weeks later.
Wow.
Oh, my.
So you get attached.
Oh, you do get attached.
Yeah.
You see bad decisions. You know they're bad decisions. Like, oh, no, don't go out with him. Don't take him back. Don't go there. And they go there, and it doesn't go well. And you find yourself cheering for them, too, when they have successes, when one woman learns to drive, and it just changes her life. You do get to know them very well.
Some people might wonder what the value is of these diaries, right?
Yes.
So let's address that. What are these diaries good for?
Well, you have to be careful when you use diaries because you don't know how a woman is crafting a diary. They may be totally authentic. They may be a woman's way to make herself look smarter. They may be a way to settle scores. They may speak only to her life. She may not be representative. But for many women, like Farm Wives, this is the only documentation you have. These aren't women who wrote short stories or wrote memoirs. They aren't women that other people wrote about. They don't have extensive correspondence. So for whole groups of women, they can offer a window into a way of life. They speak to class, they speak to race, they speak to geography, they speak to time periods. So I think they're very, very valuable. They provide a lot of depth and color to a story, but they also provide a bedrock of everyday life.
From having read hundreds of diaries at this point, are there any shifts?
There are some shifts, but there's some continuity too. If you were a 15-year-old girl, whether you're writing in 1780 or 1860 or 1920, chances are good there's going to be a lot about clothes and boys and social life. Lots of sledding, lots of ice skating, whether you're sewing the dress yourself or like little Ruthie Teichman, she goes back to school shopping at Bonwit Teller. But there's a lot about clothes. And that's pretty constant. There's shifts about educational aspirations. You know, the earliest women, they're all literate, and that's something to say about diaries. Only certain women can write diaries. You have to be literate. You have to have leisure. The farm wives, they're writing at 9 o'clock at night. There's a real compulsion there to write down things. And desire is another of the three things that you have to have. But from very poor spelling and almost no punctuation for some women, even rural young women living in small towns in America, by 1920, they're pretty much all able to write well. Relationships with parents seem to change. And again, this is only the women who write diaries. But you get the sense that women have more say in the family. Their relationship with their children seems to change. If they're mothers, there's more affection, it seems, as time goes by. It's interesting how many women in the early 19th century found ways to make money to supplement income even while they were in the home. So I've found women who make candy, many kinds of candy. It sounds delicious. They make many kinds of candy at home. There's a woman who sings for money. She's a soloist at churches in the late 1800s. There are people who alter clothes, women who alter clothes in the home, sew in the home.
So even if they weren't going to a conventional workplace,
right?
They're
not leaving the home,
income.
but they're bringing in an income.
Yeah.
It's clear how devastating it can be to lose a spouse, the main source of income. Many women with children have no resources to fall back on. And it's a dramatic change in their circumstances. Some have family that take them in. Some children get farmed out to relatives because there's no ability to support them. The difference that the advent of social services makes in women's lives is really clear.
I wonder, I mean, I know that many of the diaries are closed until after women's deaths, but are there any that are open that were written by, say, your contemporaries?
There's one, I haven't read it for the project, but I read it when I was working with the donor. It's a woman who's almost exactly my age, grew up in the Northeast. She heads what she calls chapters with the lyrics of Simon and Garfunkel songs, all of which I know. She diets. She talks about when she's in high school, all the diets she tries, and her weight goes down and down and down. And then for 3 straight days, it goes up, and she never mentions it again. There's nothing. You know, she goes to see the same movies that I saw, probably in the same months that I saw them when they were released. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah. Did it speak to you? Did it reflect your experience? So it really did.
Oh, yeah. I've read diaries of women who are exactly my mother's age, and that's been an interesting experience, too. I've read the diaries of women who are my contemporaries, but their lives are very different. There's a major push at the library to diversify our collections even further and include the voices of all women in America. And so I wanted to read the African American women whose diaries we have and whose collections are super important. I mentioned Angela Davis. There are only 2 diaries in her collection, but I'm struck by one woman who's my mother's contemporary. The absence of race in her diary is very interesting. So there's a woman named Anna James. She's the first African American female pharmacist in Connecticut. And she lives in Old Saybrook her whole life. And she owns and runs the pharmacy in town. And she belongs to the NAACP. She sends in a check every year. She comments on the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. She's supportive of African American causes, but her integration into Old Saybrook is really astonishing, possibly because she's one of the only African Americans in town. In her pharmacy, she employs what seems like every teenager in town over the years. And they all come back to see her in droves when they're home from college. They ask her advice. She's invited to their weddings. She receives the Veterans of Foreign Wars, I think, Citizen of the Year award. She's very active in the Republican Party and gets an award from them. She's a pillar of the Unitarian Church or Congregational, I'm not sure. It's the most optimistic diary I've ever read. Even when she's in a nursing home, she has a bad fall. And, she writes about her roommate who shrieks all night. And she just writes, the poor thing, she's so troubled. And she writes, the food is fine. They're doing their best. She's a wonderful woman. We have the papers of Robin Kilson. She's an African-American woman in the Harvard History Department, which is not filled with women. And, she has MS, which has a terrible impact on her life and her ability to have relationships. And she's the most beautiful writer. So her diary is pretty heartbreaking. She has a few lovers, and her breakups are excruciating. And at one point, she thinks she might be pregnant, and she's struggling to decide what to do about that. It's not long, but it's a very, very intimate diary.
I wanted to ask about, do you have a method, in broad strokes as they may be, how you go about, do you read more than one woman at a time?
I do. I've been reading 2 women at a time, but I've been trying to read a multi-volume diary and a single-volume diary. But my method is partly guided by the database that I designed. So it has a lot of biographical information. A lot of these diaries have been at the library for 50 years, and that's long before Google, before Ancestry, before Find a Grave, which is one of my favorite websites.
That I only found out about from you.
So I found out lots more biographical information than we knew originally. So I'm beefing up the biographies. I have fields for gender identity, education, occupation, religion, geographic locations, life stage when the diary is written. There's information about the diary as an object, so the measurements, what it's made out of, whether it's toilet paper or whether it's hardbound. Is it a genuine diary? Is it a repurposed ledger? We have the diary, I haven't read them yet, but I know we have them, of a woman who was in a prisoner of war type camp in the Philippines, where she would have been killed if anyone knew she was keeping her diary. And she kept it on tiny little scraps of paper. And she managed to keep it throughout this very, very dark and difficult period. And that's important for the researcher to know. So the circumstances of the diary, it takes a special woman to decide to donate her diary during her lifetime. Sometimes husbands have donated their wives' diaries. Sometimes I get the sense that it's to make up for maybe not recognizing her goals during the marriage or during her life. It's a way of apologizing, making up for maybe bad behavior, letting her voice be heard. Sometimes children give their mother's diaries as a way to honor their mother. So diaries come in lots of different ways.
And do you pick the diaries that you read next, trying to cast a wide net?
Yes, I do try and cast a wide net. I rarely read 2 diaries from the same time period, one after the other. I'm looking for small diaries, extensive diaries. I'm trying to vary it geographically. One criteria would be, though, that it's not someone I think anyone has ever heard of. So I'm starting with those first, partly because I think they do have the potential to influence scholarship, and they're the least likely to be found at random. And the way I'm trying to make sure they are found is by assigning Library of Congress subject headings to them, which I know might sound fairly dull, but the Library of Congress has thousands and thousands and thousands of subject headings that are used by archivists and librarians all around the country. And right now, there's only been time for the library staff to assign a few subject headings to each diary. But I have the luxury of being able to read the whole diary and assign sometimes 1 or 2 dozen, sometimes more for some individuals. These are word searchable across all diaries, across biographies. It's what I think is going to make the difference in people finding these. So a number of teenagers refer to other students as being stuck up. But stuck up isn't a Library of Congress subject heading, to my dismay. And so I looked up arrogant, egotistic, conceited. None of them are Library of Congress.
Well, that's at thesaurus.
I know. So I finally found, after lots of trial and error, that snob, snobism, snobbishness, and snobbery are all Library of Congress subject. So it's kind of a treasure hunt to find the right word. A lot of diaries are assigned the pretty general term housekeeping. And that's certainly useful. But if you want to break it down by the different types of housekeeping chores that women are doing, for example, lots of them do canning. And they're food historians that are very interested in food preservation. So for one woman whose work was described as housework, I've managed to find Library of Congress subject headings for caning of chairs, baking, cooking, window washing, canning and preserving, washing dishes, washing laundry, mopping, mending, sewing, cleaning, food preparation, food preservation, dusting, ironing. All of those are approved subject headings. So if you were interested in how women's days were spent in the 1880s, you might want a finer breakdown than housekeeping.
Yeah, and it strikes me as interesting too that you mentioned food historians, and we should say for the people who don't know, for our listeners who don't know, that the Schlesinger Library also has quite a large culinary collection, cookbook collection, and that kind of works across that too.
It does.
Yeah.
Evelyn Wallace, the woman whose diary I found so sad as her life ended. When she was first married and she and her husband were living on a graduate student stipend, she kept something that's not uncommon, a food diary. Making food for people she loved was very important to her. She talks about new recipes, the excitement she feels. Eventually, she reads Gourmet Magazine. We have a complete run of Gourmet Magazine at the library. She talks about finding recipes she thinks certain members of her family will like. We have women traveling abroad who are very attuned to what they eat and other cultures. Some embrace other new foods. Some are horrified and wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. A very interesting example is Henrietta Swope, who becomes a very famous astronomer. There are asteroids and things named for her. But when she was a little girl, when she's 14, her dad, who's head of Western Electric, takes her with him on a trip to China, a business trip to China and Japan. She's a very good writer, and she's very aware of all the cultural differences that she's seeing. And she writes about tea ceremonies, and she writes about lunch, and she writes about the markets that they go to. There's a lot of culinary information in her diary and in many others. And we have some diaries from girls at camp, and they talk about what kind of food they have at camp. There's one camp, Moimo Deo, where they bring the food up from Manhattan on boxcars.
Oh la la.
I know. That was a plus. It's not a plus during World War II when the camp had to shut down because they couldn't get their food. The camps that forged relationships with local farmers did not have to shut down. And those girls write of tomatoes, breakfast, lunch, and dinner in their diaries. There's one camp, Camp Walden in Denmark, Maine, where there's lobster night. And lobsters were clearly more plentiful then. There's a lot of food history. There's a lot of interest in child rearing over the ages. And there's a lot of material in diaries about acceptable ways to raise children and what mothers' aspirations are for their children, how they discipline their children, how the children react to that discipline. There's a lot of information on how women approach the aging process, some with zest, some with debilitated by illness. It's another theme that runs through the diaries.
You mentioned finding out how historical events impacted everyday life. That must be really interesting, getting that behind the scenes look.
It is.
Yeah.
You're right. But what's really striking is, maybe I just haven't read them yet, but how little the world seems to intrude on many of these diaries. Sarah Phelps is I think she's 19. She lives in Western Mass. She teaches piano. We have her diaries from, I think, 1861 to 1865. This is exactly the years of the American Civil War. And there's very little in her diary about the war. And she's 19, so she's the age of these young men who have gone off from their town. She does note when the first of them start coming back in coffins, or when news of their death comes back and the bodies don't. But it's surprising how little it intrudes. It's very personal. The sphere is very much within the family.
Yeah.
I'm sure we have plenty of others, but that's been my experience so far.
Can I give you a nudge?
Mm-hmm.
You talked about a secretary who was there at the founding of the United Nations.
Oh, yes. I'm very interested in her. And I'm excited about this diary, and I'm actually working with a foreign policy historian, and we're writing an article for a journal, and they're going to republish all of Elizabeth Morrison Hunter's diary. It's a fantastic fly on the wall account of the San Francisco Conference in the spring of 1945, from which the Charter of the United Nations emerges, signed by 50 countries. She is a graduate student's wife. He finishes his PhD at Princeton. They're living in Louisiana where he's teaching, and she writes, not in her diary, this is after the fact, she writes that their lives changed when the bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor. She and her husband, they have no children yet. They leave, and she says, like an army of young people, we went to Washington to help. And she ends up being secretary to Edward Stettinius, who's the American Secretary of State, and she goes with him as his chief secretary to San Francisco. And she writes an amazingly detailed diary about the behind-the-scenes machinations of the San Francisco Conference. So Alger Hiss, a name that would later become involved in the McCarthy hearings, Alger Hiss is sort of running the show in some ways. He's offering champagne at the drop of a hat. Any little breakthrough, he's offering her champagne. Most people think that Molotov cannot speak English, but he says good morning to her one day, and she writes about that. Anthony Eden of Great Britain winks at her in the hallway one day. I mean, these are minor things, but it adds flavor. I mean, there's an army of support staff. Just the number of telephone operators they had to have that spoke different languages to run this conference is amazing. You know, she organizes press conferences at the spur of the moment. People whisper to her things that seem to be developing behind closed doors. She has a very funny entry. Things are pretty clear that it's going to go well. And an American businessman in San Francisco has a big evening of entertainment for the delegates. And a hypnotist calls the Secretary of State, several American senators and politicians, and other delegates to the stage and he hypnotizes them and steals their watches. And this is the American Secretary of State, who apparently was not amused. But I've read a lot on the San Francisco conference, and I haven't read anything about the Secretary of State being hypnotized in front of a very large crowd. So I think her account is really remarkable, and I'm really excited about being able to publish this and have foreign relation experts see this account.
If I could ask a more personal question, so how are you, as a reader, affected by what you have read? It sounds like so many of these are so vivid. These are the lived experiences of actual human beings.
It has changed the way, particularly the way I've looked at friendships. I have a lot of very good friends, and I really value those friendships, and I try to nurture them. And I've seen in many diaries how small a life bereft of friendships can be. And I think that's made me value my own friends even more. I'm fairly recently a grandmother, and I'm very interested to see how women react to that, how they react and relate to their grandchildren. It's interesting to read about husbands and wives and long marriages. I've been married 50 years to the same person, and I am very interested in how real live couples navigate decades together. There are lots of examples of things not to do, but there are examples of things to do that you might want to incorporate in your life. But I'm always aware that these are real women. I like historical fiction, and sometimes those characters can seem very real, but these women were real. We have diaries of women that are still living, that are open. I haven't read any of those. It seems a little weird to read a living woman's diary, and if I encountered her at a dinner party, I know
too much.
Yeah. That would seem a little weird. But they are very much real to me. And I think of their children, because many of the children, I'm sure, are alive. Some women are very disappointed in their children. Some women really don't like their children. I have to think that their children were aware of this. But I don't know how that's shaped their lives. I wonder about the 3 siblings of the young woman who committed suicide. Having a mother like that, growing up like that, having that be the decision of a sibling. I'm very, very aware that these were real life people and real lives lived, sorrows felt, joys experienced.
Is there anything that we have not talked about that you feel is really important to say?
I would say, I think that diaries have the potential to open windows onto new points of view, new places, the potential to help us see issues of race and class more clearly, to understand how lives really do play out in certain situations, how relationships develop and fall apart. I think they can add richness to stories that we may think we know.
I feel like another thing that they can really do is promote empathy.
Yeah.
You know, giving such an intimate look at somebody's life is, that's a way for someone who's had a completely different experience really relate to that life.
Yeah. I think they're incredible teaching tools, particularly in high school and maybe in middle school, but to show the similarities between your life and someone's life a century before, or the differences in different cultures, to link up with the French Diary Project or the Italian Diary Project. I think they're incredible opportunities to build understanding.
So you've got hundreds more.
Hundreds.
Are you still fired up to tackle them one at a time?
Yeah. And this is everything I hoped it would be. It's fun. I feel like it's benefiting researchers. It keeps me engaged with the library. And a lot of these are collections that I brought in, and I want to see them used. I do feel an obligation to all of these women whose diaries are at the library, and especially to those whose diaries I brought in.
Mm-hmm. And you're amplifying their voice, which is a really beautiful thing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes today's program.
BornCurious is brought to you by Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Our producer is Alan Grazioso. Jeff Hayash is the man behind the microphone.
Anna Song, Kevin Grady, Lily Roberts, Sky Jung, Emerson Prond, and Cabin 3 Media provided editing and production support.
Many thanks to Jane Huber for editorial support. And we are your co-hosts. I'm Ivelisse Estrada.
And I'm Heather Min.
Our website, where you can listen to all our episodes, is radcliffe.harvard.edu/BornCurious.
If you have feedback, you can email us at info@radcliffe.harvard.edu.
You can follow Harvard Radcliffe Institute on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. And as always, you can find BornCurious wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thanks for learning with us, and join us next time.